Yes, sir. He's a very big student.
He is.
Hey, mother, I can. I'm the only one. I'm the only one who can give you a lowdown of how interesting he has been as a student. Sika.
When I finished my master's in UK, I was coming. The head of the department said, "You are leaving. How can I see?" Troublesome. I'm a good person. I'm not a child. I know sometimes I have to be managed seriously because.
But that is good.
Sometimes people misinterpret it. And so it makes me step on toes, not genuinely taking a view.
That is the way we are.
No, really, I have. What happens when they talk?
He was my son's lecturer. Yeah, I'm always saying that. Please, somebody is coming to submit his thesis. Please, receive it for me.
Okay.
And then there's a book he has to complete. Please, make sure he completes it. Ask Nana to show you.
Okay.
I beg you. Thank you. Have I satisfied everything? I'm free.
It's not free. Oh, I want to call Lenny. I don't have a number.
Hey.
Now,
It's fine. Yeah.
maybe you've gotten one of your number.
I'm not sure my daughter. Does she go anywhere?
But she has to.
Yeah, I've told her. I've been saying it. She's always.
Maybe she wants to be a sister.
No, I don't want her to do.
Hey,
02 00. Oh, my next number. Cool. I know it's not. Yeah, 0061 3805. 3805.
05.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
I've not been using
And you people go and join yourself on iPhone. Is it okay now?
Yes.
Alright, let me sanitize your hand. Yes, sir. Alright, so make sure you see the graph, so don't leave it to my people. This thing will not leave the office, so.
So I'll leave this with you.
No, submit it, but make sure you see the graph because the Turnitin has to be attached to it. Yeah. I will do. If I want my graduate assistant to come and engage a class online, she can come here. Will you be able to log in for her as me? Or I have to give her my login details, credentials? You can use yours. Okay, fine. She's taking start 166 for me. So you can log in for her for me. Okay. Let me tell her. What's your name, please?
Lovely. Lovely.
You are the guy with that name. You're ready? Oh, great. Okay, then I'll tell her. Okay. which I believe you are going to follow from henceforth. So what is our Start 474 journey going to be like? This is the first unit of Start 474, and we'll be talking about basic epidemiology. This unit is the introduction of our course. So what do I want to achieve during this session? The first thing is I would like to define epidemiology and explain the common terms as used in epidemiology. We want to describe the range of epidemiologic study design. What are the study types? Why do we do them? And why is epidemiology important at all? So these are the things we'll be looking at this afternoon, and I hope that by the end of this journey through Start 474, a lot of you will be opting to study biostatistics or epidemiology for your postgraduate pursuit in public health. So Florence Nightingale is probably the first known person to have applied statistics in medicine. And then you remember she was a nurse, and then during the war, and then she came up with this submission that statistics is the most important science in the whole world, because she was the one who introduced the use of graphics in health sciences. She also looked at the effect of colors on recovery of patients, the colors of the room and the ambience of the room on recovery of patients. So she did a lot of experimental studies. And she said statistics is the most important science in the whole world. For upon statistics depends the practical application of every other science and every other art. So you can say statistics is a science and statistics is an art. And the one science essential to all political, social administration, all education, all organization based upon experience, for it only gives the result of our experience, and that is statistics. And I always tell my students that statistics is the only course that gives you the right to play in everybody's backyard. What do I mean by that? With statistics, you can play in the backyard of education. You can play in the backyard of medicine, medical statistics. You can play in the backyard of economics as an econometrician. You can play in engineering. So statistics gives you the license to function in several fields. So for this course, we'll be focusing on statistics in health sciences. By now, we're all familiar with this appearance of being face masked and then maintaining social distance. We've gone through the period of quarantine lockdown. If you are in Kumasi or Accra, we've experienced that. It's all over the world. So if you're going to function in public health, you have to be on top of your game concerning the trending health news. And what is it about this COVID-19 thing that's made it a global pandemic? At some point, we'll also be talking about what is an epidemic and what is a pandemic. When it crosses international boundaries, then it becomes what? A pandemic. And this COVID-19 has put its footprint, the virus has put its footprint on virtually every country globally. Every country globally, virtually every one of us. We have all been affected. So we start with epidemiology. What is epidemiology to start with? We would say that in epidemiology, you're going to be studying diseases. What do you want to study about diseases? You want to study the distribution of disease. You want to study what are the factors that influence the onset of diseases. And then you want to determine the pattern of this distribution, which is what is occupying a lot of scientists now. What is the pattern of the distribution of the COVID-19 virus? So in epidemiology, you're going to be studying how disease is distributed in populations and what are the factors that determine the determining factors. So speaking in a succinct manner, you would say that epidemiology is the study of the distribution, one, and the determinants of health-related states or events. Or you might talk about causative factors of health outcomes in specified populations. And the application of this study to control of what? Health problems. Why do we study disease progressions? Why do we study disease onset? We want to protect populations. We want healthy populations. So we have to understand how and what can make our population sick. And one important thing about an epidemiologist is you will have a clinician studying individuals. Epidemiologists study populations, both the healthy ones and then the sick ones, okay? So who is an epidemiologist? He's a professional who strives to study and control. You don't only study, there's an aspect of health, of public health that is called disease control. You have to study what causes the disease, how it is being transmitted, and then you're able to control the disease. So a professional who strives to study and control the factors that influence the occurrence of disease or health-related conditions and events in specified populations or societies. That is an epidemiologist. So what do they do? What does an epidemiologist do? They will study the healthy people, they will study the sick people, they will determine the crucial difference. What is the difference between those who get the disease and those who do not get the disease, like the COVID-19 virus, those who test positive and those who remain negative, okay? So we also would study, epidemiologists would also study those who are exposed. By exposure, we mean that the person is literally exposed to the causative factors or causative agents of a particular disease. And if a person is not exposed to it, that means what? You have no contact or no exposure to that causative factor. So an epidemiologist will study all of this. Why do we need to know the disease pattern amongst exposed and unexposed persons? You need to find an association between what? The occurrence of the disease and the factor that they have been exposed to. Then you can then know either if that factor is a risk factor for the outcome of interest, or it is not what? A risk factor for the outcome of interest. So what are some of the terms that we use in epidemiology? Okay, the study of the cause of a disease, like we say, etiology of a disease, or the conditions, or the disorders, or the disabilities that result from a disease. That is part of the uses of what? Epidemiology. Another use of epidemiology is, the primary one is actually to know how to control diseases. Okay, you want to know what are the primary agents that are responsible or affecting the causative factors. Why I keep using the word causative factors or causative agents? Because you can find that there can be an association between two or more variables, but it does not necessarily mean that there's a causal relationship between them. They might even be highly correlated. While you can have high correlation, it does not necessarily result in what? In a causal relationship. But for you to have a causal relationship, a strong correlation is a prerequisite. Okay? So that means what? When this happens, when these factors or causative factors occur or are present, then the expected disease state is the thing that follows suit. Then you can talk about what? A causal relationship. Okay? There are other criteria that you need to satisfy for you to ascertain a causal relationship, but that is just to let you know in brief what it means to have a causal relationship. So don't confuse it. Causation is not the same as correlation. Okay? And then another thing that we could use epidemiology for is to determine the characteristics of the agent itself. If you understand the characteristics of the agent, for instance, we look at the transmission of malaria. So we have studied that it is transmitted by the female Anopheles mosquito. Plasmodium falciparum is the agent, the bacterial agent that causes that. So we know how to control for that. So if you want to know that, it's also easy for you to control for the spread of malaria. So for epidemiology, to determine the characteristics of the agent or causative factor helps you in the control of that disease. And so you also want to know the mode of transmission. Mode of transmission, we found out that, look, for COVID-19, for instance, initially it wasn't thought to be airborne. It's now been found to be airborne, at least it's in the air for about 8 hours. It's also person to person. It can also the virus can also stay on surfaces. So we know the mode of transmission. And that is why there's this social distancing, and there's you wear your face mask, hand washing with soap under running water, so that you put your break. It's like you're breaking the mode of transmission. You're bringing in a break in the mode of transmission. Okay? And then you also want to find what are the contributing factors to a particular disease. These are the things that epidemiologists, their skills and their tools can be useful. So what is the purpose for us to start to study epidemiology and basic biostatistics as we're doing in this course? Purpose of epidemiology, it will provide a basis for developing disease control, I said that already, and prevention measures for the groups at risk. For this particular virus, we're all at risk. Everybody is exposed, okay, because it's everywhere, it's airborne. Everyone is exposed, but sometimes you have some particular diseases that it's a group of persons that are at risk. For instance, if you're not pregnant, you can't be at risk of maternal-related death or health issues or health complications, okay? And then a person is only at risk if the person does not have the disease or that feature already. So when the person is, for instance, already HIV positive, that person is no longer at risk. You are only at risk if you do not have that disease state yet, okay? And then it also, another purpose of epidemiology is that what? You can use it for developing measures to prevent or control what? Disease. Disease control. Disease control. You see it reappearing over and over again. That is the main essence of epidemiology. And then the last one I'm going to give here is to determine the characteristics of the agent or causative factors. So what is health? If I ask you now, are you healthy? I'm sure most of you will say, oh yes, I'm healthy. But health in its space, in the proper sense of health, is not the absence of disease or infirmity. So when you really take health in the strict sense of the definition of health, virtually everyone has some health issue or the other. Okay, so a state of complete physical health can be looked at as what? Physical. It can be looked at what? Mental, and as well as what? Social well-being. So those are the three dimensions of health. Your physiological well-being, your psychological well-being, and your social well-being. So a person may not be sick physiologically, they might not be psychologically ill, but the person might have social relationship issues. So in that case, or you might even have socioeconomic challenges. So in that case, that person is also having a health issue. So when we talk about health, in the strict sense of it, it is not just talking about what? Your physiological well-being. So we're talking about a complete state, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And not simply what? The absence of disease or what? Or infirmity. So, but that you don't have a disease or you don't have a sickness or an infirmity does not mean you are healthy. Your pocket could be sick. Okay? And the person can be healthy, body and pocket, and the mind could be sick. All right. So what is disease? When we talk about disease, we're looking at it in two fronts. We're either looking at it as a physiological disease or what? Or a psychological issue. So when there's a physiological or a psychological dysfunction, then that can be deemed as what? As a disease. And then an illness will be a subjective state of not being well. Then the person is what? Is ill. While illness is subjective, sickness is not. It's affirmative. A state of social what? Dysfunction. Then you say that that person is sick. And public health puts everything together. It brings together epidemiology, it brings together disease control, it brings together health promotion. We used to call that health education. Now it's health promotion, and brings together a lot of other fields. And then in public health, bringing everything together, this will be the science and the art of preventing disease. We also want to use this to prolong life, promote health, and efficiency through organized community effort. So it has to do with the community. You want the community to be healthy by preventing diseases. You want them to live longer, more productive lives, and then they can then live more efficiently. Okay? So that is public health. Now, when you talk about epidemiology, the different types of studies, we have defined it, you know who he is, and the different types of studies. So how does an epidemiologist, how do they study these disease patterns How do you know what tools to use, what kind of study type to use? Essentially, we have two broad study types of study design. You can either be doing an analytical one or a what? A descriptive one. Okay? Under the analytical one, it could either be what? Observational or experimental. Now, if you're doing an observational study, it is different from an experimental study, because in an experimental study, you control or determine the levels of the factors. Okay, but for observational, you do not control that. So in descriptive, you're simply examining the distribution of disease in the population. And when we're talking about distribution of disease in the population, you're talking about the person, the place, and then the time. Who are the persons affected by this disease? Where are they? And at what time? So that's talking about what? The person, place, and time. You're examining the distribution of disease in the population. We can also look at gender distribution of an age or age distribution of the disease, of a particular disease. For instance, when the COVID-19 disease first broke out, it was assumed, and it is still confirmed, that those 60 and above were more at risk, and it was assumed at some point, though erroneously, that the children were exempt from it. But we recorded that there's the cases of recorded deaths of children as well. Probably they're not they don't have the kind of risk level that the over 65, whose health states are usually not in its prime form, or people who are having underlying disease conditions. So, but it is now that we found out that children are actually not exempt. So we want to know who are the persons that are affected, examining the distribution of disease in the population. Where are these persons, and at what time were they affected? Person, place, and time. This would help you in understanding disease distribution and disease spread in the population. Okay? And then we'll observe the basic features of its distribution, like I just explained now. What are the basic features? What are the symptoms it comes out with? Okay, and who are the people that it usually would affect? And it answers the four major questions. How many people are affected? Okay, who are the persons and how many are they? Who are they? Where are they? And what? When? So you talk about the how many, the who are the people, the where they are, and when. The when is the time. Where is the place? Okay? The how many and who are the persons. So it comes down to person, place, and time. Okay? And then when you're doing analytic study in epidemiology, you are investigating a hypothesis. Your hypothesis could be constructed from a prior descriptive study. So in this one, you are investigating a hypothesis about the cause of what? Of the disease. You are studying how those who are exposed contracted the disease, and those who are not exposed contracted what? The disease. So you want to answer, how do people contract this disease? Okay, and then why do they contract the disease? So in this case, you're studying how exposures relate to the disease occurrence. So this is a picture that shows you the flow of the descriptive and then the analytic. So in the descriptive, you can have a case report like the case report that came during the when HIV was first being observed. There were case reports that were published concerning some homosexual males in the States. Okay, this is a case report. It's about one case. A doctor observes a case report, and then he writes something about it, puts it in the domain of the professional discourse, so that maybe other persons are also observing it. And then when it becomes a case series, you're having repeated occurrence of these things. It becomes a case series. Okay, you can also, under descriptive, you're also having what we call the incidents. Incidents are new cases. Like you see every evening when you're watching the news, you see the new counts, new cases of COVID-19, new cases of COVID-19. Okay, the additions. Those are what? Incidents. And there are different ways you can study incidents. Another one that's also a descriptive study is a cross-sectional study. Like you take a cross-section of a fruit, you can take a snapshot or a picture of it across at a single point in time. A cross-sectional study. Cross-sectional study is done at a point in time. When you also, the other one is also the ecological study. For ecological studies, you're usually studying populations, and you're studying different populations. So that is ecological studies. All of this will come under what? Descriptive studies. Now, when you're talking about the analytic studies, you're either going to be doing an experimental or an observational. If it's an experimental, you control these factors. You determine who receives the placebo and who receives the treatment, the actual treatment. So in experimental, you can have clinical trial. You can also have a community-based study. For a community-based study, I give you an example. Let's say you're trying to introduce dietary supplements. This is a community that you're working on the improved nutrition for under 5 children. And then you have a group of children that have been exposed to the supplement, and another group that's not been exposed to the supplement. And then these two groups are the same before you start your study, and they should be exchangeable. That's what we say. So that means either group could have been the treatment and the control. So those who did not receive the treatment, the intervention will serve as a control to those who receive the treatment. So they're the same at start. Then you introduce your intervention, and then at the end of the study, you compare them. You can compare intermittently or at the end of the study. So those are community-based experimental studies. And then you have what we also call observational studies. For observational studies, you can have a cohort study, a case control study, or some other kind of other types of studies. But we will come to dealing with cohort studies, case control studies later. But just to tell you briefly, the cohort studies usually is prospective. Okay? It's prospective. Sometimes you could have a retrospective, but most often you have 9 out of 10 you have it as a prospective. That means you take a group of people, and then in this group, some are exposed to the factors or causative agents, and some are not exposed to it, and then you follow them up. It's the most informative kind of study, but when you come later on, you see that there are some advantages in having a cohort study. It's very expensive, and then there's some disadvantages. Okay, the advantages is you can determine the incidence, you can determine a lot of information, and you can also show causality between the causative agent and then the outcome. Okay, but sometimes you have retrospective. When you say that you have a retrospective study, that means what? You have taken this information and you're going back in time in the population. You're trying to find out at what point were they exposed to this thing. The outcome is already here. The disease state is already here. So you want to find out at what time they were exposed to the factors that could have put them in a disease state. And a case control study is where you have chosen those who will be your cases, and then you have those who will be the controls. The cases and the controls must come from the same population. And then the cases should represent the typical cases in the population, while the controls will also be representative of the typical controls in the population. So briefly speaking, that is what you would have in epidemiological studies. But you can also have very many variants of all of this. Okay, under descriptive studies, what can you use this for? You can use your descriptive study to generate hypotheses. In descriptive studies, you can answer the who, where, when, okay, and what is wrong with them. You can answer that. For analytic studies, in summary, you can test the hypothesis, and in analytic studies, it will answer the question of how they become disease, and why they become disease, causality. But this one, descriptive studies cannot answer it. It would only give you the person, the place, and the time kind of information. All right? So this again emphasizes the person, place, and time. So when you're talking about the person in descriptive studies, you're talking about the characteristics of the persons that become disease, or that have the disease, or that become cases. So you can talk about the age of the persons. Like in COVID-19, we know that those who are 60 and above are more prone to severe cases of COVID-19 diseases. And then you also have the males being more prone to severe cases, showing more severe cases than females. And the occupations, what kind of occupation exposes people to the disease state. So you can look at these characteristics, the age, the sex, and occupation of the individuals who are affected by the outcome. And in this case, the outcome is the disease. And where are they? It is COVID-19, they're all over the world now. Okay? So geography, where is their residence? Where do they work? Where's the hospital of the affected individual? The person, the place, and then when the events occur. When? Then you have to do the diagnosis, you do the testing, like you're doing the large-scale testing of contacts that are traced. Okay? So you're testing them to know, and when they are confirmed, you have to also do what? Do the reporting aspect of that. You have to report that. Okay? So, like I said earlier, you can do other variants of descriptive studies as well as analytical studies. So you can have ecological studies, which is an aggregated kind of study. You're comparing populations. For individual, so for ecological, it's at population level. At the individual level, the case report, the case series, the cross-sectional studies are at the individual level. But for ecological studies, it's aggregated. You're comparing populations. For instance, you're looking at the quality of air in some cities. And then, or you can be comparing, maybe you're comparing the quality of air in the Accra to Kumasi and Tamale, or you might even be comparing countries. You can be comparing disease prevalence in countries. Maybe you're looking at the cases of bronchitis. You can look across countries. Okay? And then for cross-sectional study as a descriptive study, you have to be your focus is on what? What is the purpose of the study? Okay? The purpose will be what? You want to take, how do I explain this now? You want to learn about the characteristics of the population. That essentially is why you want to do a cross-sectional study. You want to learn about the characteristics, but you're not learning about these characteristics on a long-term basis. You are learning about this at a point in time. So you're taking like a snapshot of this population. Okay? And then for cross-sectional study, we're not comparing groups. We're usually just observing what the features are at that point in time. And all members of a small defined group can constitute your population. Once they are properly defined, it could be a sample from a large group. That would be the population you're studying. And then what do I want to do? I'm interested in the results, because if I know how many persons, for instance, in a group have tested positive for malaria, for instance, then you can talk about the prevalence of malaria in that particular group, in that particular community. Okay? So essentially, when you're doing cross-sectional studies, the key thing you're really looking out for is what? Is prevalence. It is prevalence. Okay? I think this one, I already showed you this earlier, so to show you that you can still go further on that. Okay? Now, basic epidemiological assumptions are that human disease does not occur at random. It does not occur by chance. Disease does not occur by chance. You have diseases that are caused by agents, and you have some diseases that do not have specific causative agents that have risk factors. For instance, if we're looking at cancer, it will be if cancer of the lungs. It's not like a bacteria or something particularly would cause cancer or breast cancer. Okay? For cervical cancer, while it is non-communicable, but we can say that cervical cancer has been shown to have a causative agent, okay, which is a human papillovirus. I think some strains of that have been associated with cervical cancer in women. So it does not just occur at random. While you have these ones not having particular causative agents, but you have other diseases that have causative agents. When you have tuberculosis, it has a causative agent. So we have two types of diseases essentially. We have the ones that we will call the communicable diseases, and the ones that we'll describe as what the non-communicable diseases. The communicable diseases are the ones that can be transferred from person to person, and the non-communicable diseases are the ones that cannot be transferred from person to person. And those ones that can be transferred from person to person, usually you would find that there are agents or vectors that move these causative factors around. Now, if a person is overweight, okay, if a person is overweight, a person does not exercise, and then you don't really watch your diet as well, you're probably eating high cholesterol meals. I'm not talking now about hereditary, okay, or genetic issues, because some diseases are also transmitted through the genes. So now let's put that one not being considered. So if you are doing all of this, you don't exercise, you're overweight, you don't watch your risk of having what? Diabetes or even cardiovascular issues are higher. That means you have risk factors, increased risk factors. These are not agents, disease-causing agents. So you have some that it has agents, some doesn't have agents. And these things don't just occur by chance or at random. Okay, it doesn't occur by chance. If you're not exposed to the COVID-19 virus, you're not going to have the disease. So human disease have causal and preventive factors, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize. Okay, so if I work out regularly, I maintain a good body mass index. I watch my meals. I take proper rest. I'm reducing the risk factors of some diseases. So you can have causal as well as preventive factors. Now, when you bring preventive factors to inhibit you are trying to inhibit the causal factors from the person. Now, I'll give you this example. If you use mosquito net in the night, is a measure or is a preventive measure? You sleep under mosquito net. It's a preventive measure. What are you preventing? You are preventing the contact between the mosquitoes who are carrying the malaria parasite from getting in contact with the person that is sleeping under the net. That is a preventive measure. I hope I have explained this a bit and not confused you. Okay? So if you want to investigate an epidemic like what we have now, what do we do? This section is essentially to introduce you to a lot of terms, a lot of things that is done in epidemiology. From the second unit onwards, you will see that we'll begin to build on this. So I'm just trying to lay the ground rules today and then help you understand some of the terminologies that you'll be coming across as we go on. So an epidemic occurs when there are significantly more cases of this same disease than past experience would have predicted for that place at that time and for that population. So let's assume that normally if you have a community hospital and you see that the number of cases of malaria, maybe for the entire rainy season, hypothetically, should be about, maybe they see some 20 cases every week. And then you find out that for the same period in another year, you're beginning to see 30, 40 cases every week. Okay, then you are dealing with what we call an epidemic. So that means what? There is always, for some diseases, there is always an endemic state of some diseases. For instance, malaria, where Ghana is an endemic region for malaria. Malaria is endemic in Ghana. So there's a level of prevalence that we would always be observing. It is when this level of prevalence is exceeded that we talk about we have an epidemic. Okay? Sometimes you say, oh, there's an outbreak of cholera. We have used that term before. The outbreak is more appreciable than when you say there's an epidemic. An epidemic could also create some kind of panic in the community. Okay? So when the cases are higher than what you would normally observe at that particular place, in that particular time, and within that particular population, then you say you have an epidemic. Okay, so the disease in the individual may be considered the outcome of the interaction of what? 3 factors. Now, you know you have what is called the epidemiological triad, which is, okay? So you have the agent, the host, and then what? The environment. You have the agent, host, and then you have what? You have the environment. So when these 3 come into play, it can also lead to what? A disease. But it's been shown that this epidemiological triad does not work in all cases. This might work for a disease that has a causative agent. It doesn't work for non-communicable disease, and even some diseases that have a causative agent, this does not necessarily suffice. So there are other models that we would later look at, but this is the simplest one: the agent, the host, and then the environment epidemiological triad. This is one of the first that came. Okay. So when you want to investigate an epidemic, you have to be interested in the present characteristics, which we said earlier. You have to look at what? The place where it is happening. Okay, is it in the workplace, or is it in the residence, dwelling, or workplace? You have to look at both of them. And then the time. And then when we talk about the time, we're talking about what time was the onset of the disease, and as well as how long is the disease, or the duration of the disease. And this should include what? The latent state and the symptomatic state of what? Of the disease. Okay? All right. And then how do you analyze this? You could do what we call the epidemiologic curve. Epidemiology curve will be monitoring the number of cases. It will also keep track of the incubation period for the disease. So you can use an epidemiologic curve, and then you can also use this information when you have the person, place, where, and the time information. You can calculate the attack rates. Okay, the attack rates of the disease attack rates. How at what rate does it attack, or does it attack persons? To try to put it in the simplest form for you. Okay, so you can look at the attack rate, and the attack rate might be different for different for the different age groups, different genders, different kinds of occupational categories. So you can look at the attack rate. Then you can also plot the geographic distribution of cases by residence. You know, sometimes you see the COVID-19 plot, and then you have the red colors, the circles, and the bigger the circle is, the more the number of cases that have been reported in that particular country or region. So that is what we're talking about. You can use the pictorial representation as well, using the geographic distribution plot. Okay? Then further on, you can also compute the rate. One of the rates you compute is the attack rate, where rate is the ratio. The other day, I was asking in the class that what is the difference between a ratio and a proportion. And I'm going to leave you with that as well. Okay, so in epidemiology, you use rates. You also use what? Proportions. All right? Both of them are ratios, but there's a difference in them. Okay, ratios and proportions rather, not rates. Ratios and proportions. What the difference between ratios and proportions? That's what I really want to find out from you. If you know the difference, and then you can use the rate to know the time-dependent proportion. Okay? All right. So if you want to know the attack rate, so you'll be looking at the proportion of the population that develops the disease among the total exposed. Okay? Now, so we're saying that what is the total number that are exposed? And I said earlier, if a person already has the disease, that person is no longer what? Exposed. Except it's a disease from which you can go through, you recover from, and come back into exposure state. Okay, let's assume we're looking at people who have it and those who do not have it. So the total, the numerator in this case is the number of persons, number of ill persons who are made ill by this particular disease. Okay, and you're dividing this by what? Number of persons at risk. Number of persons at risk. So, if you're looking at number of persons at risk, for instance, in this instance, it will be the total number of persons in that population, and you subtract from this the number of the ill persons. That would be the attack rate. Okay? So when you're talking about rates, generally, it will be the event in a specific or specified time period divided by what? The population at risk. Okay? In that specified time period. So is this rate? Is it a proportion or is it a ratio? Okay? So in this unit, I've tried to explain a lot of terms, and you have to take your time to go over it again, and then so that you can understand it before you go into the course properly so that you can have a full complement of what you should have. So one of the things we have talked about in this section is what is epidemiology. We have talked about the definition, how you study the distribution, and then the factors that cause the diseases, and then in the population, so that we can use this information to what? To prevent the spread of disease. We also looked at what does an epidemiologist do. We looked at that. We looked at the study types, which can either be descriptive or analytic. Okay, and then we also looked at when you're studying an epidemiologic outbreak, what do you study? You're looking at the persons, the places, and the time. Okay, and then we talked about what? If it's a descriptive study, it will answer the questions of who, where, when. Okay, but when it's an analytic study, it will answer the question of how and why the diseases occur. Okay, I hope this session will be useful for you. It's been a lot for you to chew in just a few minutes. I think less than an hour, about an hour. So, but if you go over it and then over and over again, you find out that because it's not the same as what you do in the class every time, it's not using probability distribution theory. So this is a new thing for you, and I appreciate that. But try and picture yourself working in health, and we talked about what? Epidemiologists study populations, the clinicians study what? Individuals. Remember, the epidemiologists, you will study those who are sick and those who are also what? Healthy. Okay? That's one of the things that you really have to remember. And then when we're talking about study designs, some are at the person level, some are at what? Aggregated level. Ecological study is usually what you talk about at aggregated level because you're often comparing population, you're comparing communities. The other ones, theories, case reports, they're all at what? Individual levels. Okay? Some of the review questions I would like to go over with you is what is health? In this section, we have discussed that health is not the absence of disease. So if you're talking about health, you're talking about the physiological aspect of health, you're talking about the psychological aspect of health, and then the social aspect of health, of the person's well-being. So it's not just the absence of disease or infirmity that says the person is what? Is healthy. And who is an epidemiologist? I just went over that. Okay? They study people who are healthy, they study people who are sick, they study people who are exposed to causative agents, they study people who are unexposed to causative agents. Essentially, what do they want to do? They want to find out who, where, when, how, and why, so that they can prevent disease. When they prevent the disease, they want the population to be what? To enjoy a healthier, longer, more efficient life. Okay? And then we also did a distinguishing between the descriptive and analytical study designs in epidemiology. So I'll be meeting you shortly in the second unit of this course. Thank you very much, and do have a nice day. Yeah, where's my headmaster? Oh, don't worry, anything. Can I check my phone? Yes, sir. Yeah. There's two unit 2s, right? There are two. There's unit 2A and unit 2B, isn't it? No, there's a 2B. I sent it to Chris. I have 2, and then I have 2B. Huh? Oh, it's a good one. Oh, so I can't use it, or I can use it. Are you on Wi-Fi? No, don't convert, and then my station will go and do that. No, I don't want to do that. I can do 2B today. 2 is very long. Mm. Can't you do the projection such that the next slide that's coming up is also, I can see it there? You know that one that you have the current slide and then the next coming slide? Or you can't do that? Hey, I have to go and pick my son up. Oh, they are going to say, oh, okay. Uh-oh. This is Hey, this one is long. I can't finish in 2 times. Part of Unit 2, we'll go to the second part of Unit 2, and then we'll go back to what I mentioned earlier, the epidemiological triad, the sufficiency component approach to determining causation. Okay, so we're going to be looking at those two together. First unit is going to be the first section of this unit. We're going to be talking about how do we measure health and disease, and then the second section of it we're going to be talking about what disease causation. Okay, now all those terms are introduced in the first section. I'm going to be using them like you chew it every day. Okay, all right. So what are the objectives for this section? We want to explain the need for denominators in epidemiology. How do we measure diseases? What is the denominator? Sometimes you have some measures of disease that the numerators are different and the denominators are the same. And sometimes the numerators are the same and the denominators are what? Are different, okay? And describe how person time at risk is estimated in follow-up studies. Now, you remember we talked about what the person, place, and time, and when you talk about person time, is the entire period for which that person was in an exposed state before he became diseased or did not become diseased at all. Okay, then we calculate different measures of disease frequency. We can distinguish between them, okay? That's when the issue of the ratio and proportion that I asked you in the first section. Then the use of different measures of exposure. And before we go in, I should also tell you that when you're making comparison, essentially we can be comparing, usually we're comparing relatively or we're comparing in what? In absolute terms. So there are going to be some measures that are relative comparison like the odds ratio, which you will soon get to meet, and then some other measures like absolute risk, which is an absolute comparison. Let's take it this way. For instance, if you have 100 Ghana cedis and I have 10 Ghana cedis, in relative terms, you have 10 times more than what I have. But in absolute terms, you have 90 cedis more than what I have. So when we're relative comparisons, you're looking at ratios. Absolute comparison, we'll be looking at what? Differences. Okay, so what are the fractions that we use in describing disease frequencies? We use ratios. Okay, you have one value over the other, that is a ratio. And that is a fraction in which what? The numerator is not part of what? The denominator. This is a ratio. But when you talk about the proportion, it is not so. So if you look at fetal death ratio, this will be the fetal deaths which are not included among what? The life deaths. Fetal death ratio is the number of fetal deaths divided by what? The total life deaths. Okay? And then we also can look at proportion. In proportion, you also have it as a fraction. Ratio and proportion, both of them are fractions. Okay? But in the proportion, the numerator is also part of the denominator. And that is where you have a difference. Okay? In this case, what? You can have fetal death, which is divided by what? All births. All births will become those who are stillbirths and those who are what? Live births. Okay? So I go back again. You can look at the fetal death ratio. This is the number of fetal deaths divided by what? Live birth. Now, the fetal birth rate, on the other hand, is going to be what? The fetal death divided by what? All births. In which case, the numerator is also contained in what? In the denominator. Okay? And then rate, again, you can talk about rate, and then rate, once you talk about the rate, you're bringing in the concept of what? Time. And then when you're talking about rates, you're talking about the change or the rate at which something changes over time, or the how do you say, the rate of coronavirus prevalence or something over time. Rate brings in the function of what? Time. It's relative to time. That is one thing I should just make clear. Okay? But in practice, we often use proportions and rate what? Interchangeably. Okay? But the truth of the matter is you have your proportion, you have your ratio, and then you have rate. The ratio proportions do not bring in the factor of time. But once you have a rate, we're usually talking about what? Time dependency. Okay? Like you're talking about the maternal mortality rate for what period? There's a time factor implied there. So measures of disease frequency, when we're measuring disease frequency, we're either talking about what prevalence, which we talked about in the first unit, which will come from what a cross-sectional what study, and you can also be talking about what incidence. Incidence will come from a cohort study, a follow-up study, a prospective study. That in that case, you know how many of the persons at risk became cases. So for prevalence, prevalence is the number of cases of disease or infection in a population at one point in time. If you have looking at prevalence at one point in time, then what you are simply looking at is what point prevalence. One point in time. We do a cross-sectional study. You remember in the first unit, cross-sectional study, you're taking a snapshot at a point in time. So how many persons in this population or in this community have this disease or this infection, and how many do not have it? So the number of infected persons divided by the total persons in that community will give us what? The point prevalence. Now, if you're looking at period prevalence, you'll be looking at prevalence over a period of time. How many do you have within a year? Okay, so you can have point prevalence and you can have what? Period prevalence. Then incidence. Incidence is not the same as prevalence. Incidence feeds into prevalence. So it's like a faucet. I think I have a picture somewhere. No, I don't have it in this place. It's like you have a faucet or you have an inlet, and incidence is your inlet. Okay, incidence is your inlet, and this is the population, and then this will be what? This will be your prevalence. Okay, and if it's a disease from which people can recover for, one of the outlets from this will be what? Recovery. They might recover, and another outlet could be what? That people die from this. These are the things that will determine your prevalence. So in prevalence, you are measuring at a particular point in time, how many persons are infected. So if the person has already died, it's not part of your prevalence at that point in time anymore. Okay? It could be part of the period prevalence, but it will not be part of the point prevalence. Okay? And if a person had it at that point, but has recovered before the time of your study, it will also not be captured there. So the incidence is the number of cases of a condition present in a population at a point in time or a given time period. When you're looking at incidence for a given time period, the total number of new cases for a given time period, then we're looking at what? Cumulative incidence. And cumulative incidence is the same as what we sometimes call what? The risk. Okay. Okay. Can you edit and take that portion out? Or okay. All right. So measures of disease frequency, we can use prevalence, we can use incidence, we can use cumulative incidence or what we call risk, then the odds of disease, and then we can also look at what? The incidence rate. Then we look at this, each one in succession. Okay? So what is the prevalence rate? Like I told you, prevalence is what? The number of persons that have the disease in the population, either at a point in time or what? Or over a period of time. In this case, the numerator is part of what? The denominator. That is one distinctive feature that you should bear in mind that distinguishes prevalence from incidence. Incidence, the denominator is simply the persons at risk. And this is divided into two. Point prevalence or what? Period prevalence rate. Point prevalence, the cross-sectional study, for instance, how many have the infections, how many do not have the infections. So it's going to be the number of infected persons divided by the total number of persons in the population. That is point prevalence rate. For the period prevalence, we're looking at this over a period of time. So examples of point prevalence could be, like I said in the other unit, we're doing a community study. We've done general screening for malaria cases. We're using the RDT. So how many came positive? How many were not positive? Okay, that will give us a point prevalence of malaria in the community. So point prevalence is the proportion of individuals in a specified population at risk the population at risk. You remember the population has to be at risk all the time. The population at risk who have the disease of interest at a given point in time. Okay? Who have the disease of interest at a given point in time. The population is at risk, but the persons might not be at risk. So in this case, when we're talking about persons at risk, we're talking about persons who do not have the disease yet or the infection yet. If the person is already infected, is no longer at risk, but the population is at risk. Okay, so period prevalence on the other hand is going to be proportion of individuals in a specified population at risk who have the disease of interest over what? A period of time. So that's the distinction between the two of them. While one is at a point in time, this other one is what? A period of time. We can look at annual prevalence rate of malaria in Ghana, a lifetime prevalence rate of a particular disease. So when the type of prevalence rate is not specified, it is usually what? Point prevalence. Most of the time when they calculate prevalence, it is usually point prevalence or its closest approximation. If it's period prevalence, it should be clearly specified that it is a period prevalence, and the period under consideration will be indicated whether it's an annual or quarterly prevalence rate. Okay, so when we talk about prevalence, the proportion of disease at a given point in time, you can see here is showing that the blue portion is the entire adult population, and then you have those who are diabetics as a black portion here. So you see that the disease or persons with the outcome of interest are also part of the entire population. So for the prevalence, number of diabetic cases divided by what? The entire adult population. The entire adult population will contain those who have diabetes and those who do not have diabetes. Okay? So incidence and cumulative incidence or attack rate. So you have a total population here that do not have diabetes is on your left, is the blue one. And then if you have an attack rate of say 0.5, so that's the proportion of cases that persons in the population that become diabetic. If it's 0.5, then the incidence rate, or what we'll call the attack rate, will be like half of the population between 2010 and 2014 becoming what? Diabetics. Okay, so the attack rate will be like 50% of the entire population. Okay, so if you stop being at risk, you are not part of the incidence. If you're not at risk, you are not part of the incidence. A person that already has the case, that's already a case rather, is no longer at risk. A diabetic person will no longer be at risk. I think I've said this over and over again. So by now you know the population can be at risk, but within the population you have persons who are at risk and persons who are not what? At risk. And then we also have the incidence rate. Incidence rate is also divided into two. You can have a cumulative incidence rate and you have what? Incidence density. For cumulative incidence, which we often rate, which we often will call risk, most of the books, is the number of new cases of a disease occurring over a specified period of time in a population at risk. Now, if you look at the report, daily reports, you will see that you have total cases for COVID-19. You always have the total cases. Sometimes you have the total global case, now over 3 million. This includes all those who died, those who have recovered, and those who are presently having the disease. The total cases, okay? But for the total cases, you will also see what is also called what? The new cases. The new cases. The new cases is what the incidence is talking about. The new cases, the number of new cases. That is the incidence. Those are those who are now becoming cases. Okay, and usually you can have, I think in Ghana we sometimes report over a few days. Over a few days, you have the new cases after a few days. Some do daily count. Okay, so that will be the new cases. Maybe daily new counts, and maybe daily new counts, or what? Weekly new counts. Those are what will constitute the incidence. So the cumulative incidence rate is the number of new cases of the disease occurring over a specified period of time in a population at risk at the beginning of what? The interval. So if you're looking at the weekly reporting format, you'll be looking at what? The number of new cases within the week. So cumulative incidence is the number of new cases of a disease in a given time period divided by what? The number of disease-free persons at the beginning of that time period. Now, if yesterday, if maybe if it's a weekly reporting staff, and then the previous week in a community, maybe the population was 1,000 persons, and then at the end of the previous week, you had 20 persons having the disease, okay? And then we take another week, and within this new week that we have taken, you have maybe 10 new cases, okay? These previous 20 persons are not part of your incident for this week, for this current week that you're studying. Those ones will constitute your part of your prevalence, but these 10 cases are those who are of interest. And because these 20 persons were already cases or infected before you started the study, your denominator for assessing the risk, the number of persons that are disease-free, only 980 of these 1,000 persons were disease-free at the beginning of this week where you were studying this. So it's not the 1,000 persons that you will be focusing on, but it's the number of persons out of this 1,000 that did not have the disease. So that 980 will constitute what? The number of disease-free persons at the beginning of that time period. So example is if we count all new cases of influenza occurring in MSc undergraduate from September 1st, 1997 to August 31st, 1998, that's for 1 year period. And then we take as the denominator all undergraduates enrolled. We would be describing the cumulative what? Incidence rate, because it's over that long period of time. When they all enrolled, they did not have the disease. So we're talking about how many of these enrolled students had influenza in that period. Because at the beginning of that period, none of them had influenza. So the total number of enrolled students will be our denominator. Okay, it's a different thing if you say that you had 500 students enrolled, and of these 500 students, you already had some 50 of them who are already having this disease or this infection. So the disease-free number of students at the beginning or at the point of enrollment will not be 500, but rather what? 450. And then the other one is the incidence density, which is the number of new cases of the disease occurring over a specified period of time in a population at risk throughout that what? Interval. Throughout the interval. Okay? All right. I have it on slide. So in this case, the numerator does not differ between the two types of what? Incidence. In the two types of incidence, the numerator is still the same, the number of new cases. It is, however, the denominator that differs in incidence densities from what? Cumulative incidence, because of attrition. Attrition is the rate of fallout from the population. Okay? It's frozen. In the example that we gave of the enrolled students, your attrition will be students who left the school during the year, because not all the students will be part of the student population at the end of the period if we're looking at what? Cumulative incidence, because this is over a long period of time. Okay? So some of them would have fallen out from the program, some left school during the year, and then some students probably also unfortunately died. And then students also who had influenza once, so that means they had some kind of immunity to the influenza disease, so they will not have it again. So they will not be part of your population at risk. Or sometimes you also have diseases for which you have a vaccination. So if a student has the vaccination, it's not supposed to be part of the those at risk. And then some students who were not part of the student population at the beginning but entered during the period under consideration, they became part of your student population. They would also affect your student group. So Incidence density requires us to add up the entire period of time each individual was present in the population. So exposure period for each individual is the necessary information for you or for us to calculate what incidence density. This is where the present time comes into play. How long was this person exposed to this disease? For instance, a student, let's make it simple here and then use 5 or 10 students. We'll make it simple here. Let's look at this, and then we're considering just 5 students. And then you have where I have X is if the onset of the disease. X is the student state, healthy state. O is the onset of disease. So if you have a continuous line, that means what? This particular student did not have the disease. And let's say the total period under study is just 3 months. So this is 1 month here, this is 2 months here, and the end of our study here is what? Is the 3rd month. I just want to keep it simple for you. And now this other student already came in with the disease, okay, or came in and become disease at this period. Okay, O is the onset of disease, and then the student is still in the population. And then you have another one who was healthy and then becomes has a disease onset at this point, and you have that. And then let's say you have another person who started pretty early. Okay, you have one healthy person again, and then let's bring in one more person here. Another person who also onset of disease, and then Good. Okay, if we're looking at time incidence, and then not cumulative now. So if you look at it, let's say this 1 month is our time T1, okay? Between the start and time T1, our incidence is only what? These 2 guys, okay? These 2 persons, that's at time T1. If we're looking at time T2, and then time T2 maybe is at the end of the period, which is the 3rd month, okay? And you're looking at the new cases, there will be 3 of them out of the 5. There will be 3 cases. But if you're looking at for the cumulative one, for the cumulative, or the incidence density, you look at individuals. Now, this individual was at risk for 3 months. This individual was at risk for 1 month before it became into the disease state. This individual was at risk for 2 months, disease-free period of this person, 1 month and 3 months. So if you're doing this, you have to calculate the disease-free period for each of these individuals, and then you sum that up, and that constitutes your denominator in this case. So we're talking about what? The person time, okay? So this will be person months at risk when we calculate everything. It could be years you're talking about, then will be what? Person years at risk, okay? So time period can be person months, as I have illustrated there. It could be days, it could be hours, depending on the disease process being studied, okay? Another thing we can also look at is the mortality rate. Mortality rate is also a type of what? Incidence rate, okay? We will discuss this in more detail in our next session. And we would come across the mortality rate when we're using routine data, routine health data. And then we'll say, what are the limitations of what? Of routine health data. So what are the uses of incidence and prevalence? Incidence, normally we use this for acutely acquired what? Diseases. So, for instance, we're looking at the COVID-19. Why are we so concerned, so occupied by the number of new cases? Incidence is the incidence, okay? In this case, because of it's an acute disease, and then that means what? The risk of it is effectivity of this disease is very high. So the incidence is what determines whether we're winning the war against the COVID-19 or we're losing the war. Not only the number of mortalities, number of incidences. If you're looking at number of mortalities, it's relatively low compared to number of incidents. So when the person contacts the disease, the risk is higher for that person. Whether or so we don't know whether the person will recover or would develop the more severe state of the disease. Okay, so incidence is also important. It's more important when we're thinking about what? The etiology of the disorder. When you're talking about the disease history, the progression of the disease progression. Incidence is also very important. Prevalence is when we're thinking of what? The societal burden of the disease, including the cost and resources consumed as a result of this disease. Now, if you look at Ghana, we have a little over 2,000 cases now. And then if you're looking at the burden on the health system, because most of the cases are being home managed, we don't have the ICU facility. So let's, heaven forbid, you have 1,000 persons who need to have ICU facilities. We'll run into an issue. I'm not sure we have that to handle. And you're looking for maybe 2,000 persons to be placed on ventilators. We don't have all of this. So where prevalence in that case helps you more in the planning process. Okay, planning hospital facilities and the health facility distributions. That is where you really need to work on the prevalence and the burden of the disease. How much is it costing the government? Remember when we were under the partial, it was a lockdown, total lockdown in Kumasi and Accra metropolis. You remember there was a lot of there were lots of persons who could not earn their wages because they are on daily wages, and the government had to come in with interventions to provide daily meals for this person, and it cost a lot of money. And then the government is still providing water to several communities for about 3 months, another 2 months now. It's been about a month now. Also the subsidy on electricity. So when you're looking at prevalence, you're looking at the costs and resources consumed as a result of the presence of that disease. Incidence always requires what? A duration. And prevalence may not. You can estimate prevalence from a cross-sectional study, but incidence you have to follow up over time to know where are the new cases. Okay. Another thing is that in incidence, the unit of analysis is the event, a new case. In prevalence, it is what? The person. So where in the incidence we're interested in what? Number of new cases. Where if it is prevalence, we're looking at the total persons that have this thing relative to all the persons in the population. Thus, incidence may exceed 100%, maybe annual incidence of colds, okay, for instance, but you cannot have that happening with prevalence. Prevalence can never exceed 100% because you can't have more than the entire population or having the disease, or the infection. Incidence generally requires what? An initial disease-free state before the counting starts, because incidence is measured only in those at risk of disease. Like what we were showing here earlier, we assumed that all the 5 persons were what? Were disease-free at the beginning of our study here. Okay, so we assume they were all disease-free. So for incidence, for you to become a case, you have to have been in a disease-free state at the beginning of the study. So what do we do with incidence density and cumulative incidence? For incidence density, which tells us what? The incidence over a period, it gives the best estimate of the true risk of acquiring disease at any point in time. Because if you're looking at it at time T1, for instance, you're looking at only 2 persons. If you're looking at it at time T2, you're time 2 here, you're also looking at 2 persons. But if we had a lot of persons and we follow them over a long time, you can see that you're looking at the person time, like it gives you a true picture of the risk of of acquiring the disease at any point in time. And cumulative incidence gives the best estimate of how many people will eventually get the disease in an enumerated population. So that's why we do incidence density, and then we do what? Cumulative incidence. So what is the relationship between incidence and prevalence? Like I showed you in that sketch in the previous section, we said that incidence feeds the prevalence. So if you assume that in a steady state, that is, if incidence is not changing and the population is also a stable population, where it's a closed population, there's no migration, there's no movement in and out, and then there's no exit from the population. Incidence, the prevalence rate will be what? Incidence times what? The duration of the disease. These are some of the factors that would affect prevalence of the disease. For instance, if it's a disease that the duration period for that disease is very short, you might not have a high number of persons having it in the prevalence when you're doing the prevalence estimation. But if the disease takes like 4 months for a person to recover for it, you will see that when you're doing prevalence, you have a higher number being represented because the rate at which they exit from infected state is slower than if the disease were a 2-week kind of a infection, maybe a cold or something. So this is the picture I was trying to find earlier. So you can see this faucet gives us what? The incidence. So this is our bathtub. Our bathtub contains what? The prevalence, our bathtub. So if the faucet runs the water, which is our new cases, it runs it into the bathtub. Exit through the plug will be what? Emigration. So maybe some people have this infection in this population, but they go elsewhere. Okay? Another source that could affect our immigration, remember, like the government had to forcefully quarantine people who were coming from overseas, and then from which they were found, the first time they quarantined, they found quite a number of coronavirus carriers amongst them. Okay, so immigration, new inlets into the population, can also affect what? The prevalence of a disease or an infection in the population. Also, so if another point that you can also have exiting and affecting the prevalence number is what? Excess death rate. If it's a disease or an infection that has a high fatality rate and people die a lot from it, like you had been experienced in the United States, the fatality rates were quite high. We had that in Europe, in Italy, in Spain. People were dying thousands in a day. Okay, so if you have a high fatality rate, it will also deflate what? The prevalence. It will also reduce the prevalence. So we can now talk about what? Measures of exposure and what? Of exposure effect, rather, measures of exposure effect. And then, like I told you at the beginning of this session, these measures of exposure effect can either be what? Relative or what? Absolute. When we're talking about relative, then we're looking at what? We're looking at the ratio, and when we're talking about or a fraction, when we're talking about absolute, then we're looking at a difference. Okay? So relative risk, we can compare two groups. We can compare an exposed group and what? An unexposed group. So relative risk, these are groups. These are a group of measures. We can have risk ratio, rate ratio, and what? Odds ratio. We'll come to this one at a time. Okay. So ratio is the probability that the outcome characteristic is present for one group relative to the other group, and usually that it is the group for which it is present is usually the exposed group, and the other group for which it is not present is usually the what? The unexposed group. Or you could compare two groups and see the relative risk. So we can have sample proportions with characteristics from groups 1 and groups 2. So if the number of persons with the outcome in group 1 is N11, and the number of persons with the outcome of interest in group 2 is N21, and the total number of persons in group 1 is N1 dot, you know the 2 by 2 contingency table. I'm sure you remember the 2 by 2 contingency table. So where you have maybe you just have a yes, a no, and these are exposed, maybe, or this is group 1 and this is what? Group 2. Then you have N11 here. That is number interesting. Row 1, column 1, and here you have what? N12 here, and then here you have what? N21, and you have N22. So if you have the total number of persons in group 1 will be what? N1 dot. Total number of persons in group 2 will be what? N2 dot. The total number of no's will be N.2 total number of yeses will be n.1. So you have, these are the marginal totals and these are the cell frequencies. So this is what I'm referring to here. So you have the part 1 had a risk for this group 1 had to be n11 over the total number of persons in group 1, and for this one will be n21 over total number of persons in group 2. So if having this information, then we can estimate, calculate our risk ratio, our rate ratio, and then our odds ratio of the disease. Okay, where yes means the disease is present and no means where the disease is not present. So the risk ratio will be what? The risk for the group 1 relative to what? The risk for group 2. We say group 1 is usually the exposed group, and then the unexposed group is our group 2. I mean group 2, because what we're trying to measure is the measure of effect of exposure on disease outcome. And then the rate ratio will be what? The incidence rate in this group divided by the incidence rate in the unexposed group. And then the odds ratio. What is the odds of a disease? The odds of a disease, odds is not like a probability. Odds is the ratio of probabilities. Odds is what? The probability that the outcome occurs divided by the probability that it does not occur. So we can find the odds for group 1 for the exposed, which is going to be this over this divided by this over that. At the end of that, that gives n11 over n12. That will be odds for the exposed of the disease for the exposed. And if you're looking at odds for the disease will be what? n11 over n21. And then that the disease does not occur. You can also have the unexposed odds will be what? n21 divided by what? n22. While the odds that the disease does not occur will be the odds for no. So when you find a ratio of these odds, that is when we talk about what? Odds ratio. And then for the relative risk, you'll be talking about pi 1 r divided by what? Pi 2 r. You can also construct confidence intervals for relative risk. And then when you do a ratio comparison and you obtain 1, that means what? You have an equal likelihood, because if you have a ratio and it is 1, that means the numerator and the denominator are the same in magnitude. Okay? So using the difference of proportions alone to compare the two groups can be misleading when both of these proportions are very close to what? Zeros. Okay? And you can also have the problem with the sampling distribution. It is highly skewed. So if I have a relative risk and I've used the confidence interval, so the probability will conclude if the confidence interval is entirely above 1, it does not contain 1, but it is entirely bigger than 1, then we will say that what? That means the numerator is bigger than the denominator. That means the risk of the disease is higher for the exposed group than for the other unexposed group. So we conclude that the probability that the outcome is present is higher in the population for group 1 if the entire interval is above 1. So if the entire interval, the confidence interval, is entirely below 1, that means what? The risk is higher for the denominator group than it is higher for the numerator group. And then if the interval contains 1, you cannot decide, you cannot conclude, because it's equally likely for the two groups. When you have it containing 1, then that means the numerator and denominator are essentially the same. The risk for the two groups are about the same in relative terms. So if you're looking at odds ratio now, so odds of an event is the probability that it occurs divided by the probability that it does not occur. So odds are strictly what? Non-negative. So when you have the odds with value greater than 1, when there's a success, it's more likely than what? A failure. Okay? So the odds is the ratio of probabilities. So when the odds of a success is bigger than the odds of a failure, then you have the value greater than 1. For instance, when you have an odds, let's say 4, then you say that the success is about 4 times more likely as what? As a failure. Okay? So why do we call this odds ratio a cross-product ratio? Okay? This is simply because when you say the odds for exposed group here, it will be n11. The odds for the exposed group is that the exposed person becomes a yes, will be N11 divided by what? N1 dot. That it is a no is what? N12 divided by what? N1 dot. So essentially this will give you N11 divided by what? N12. And then for the unexposed group, the same would apply, so that you end up with what? N21 divided by what? N22. So this is the odds for exposed. This is the odds for what? Unexposed. So if you want to find the odds ratio for the exposed to unexposed, it's going to be N11 divided N12 multiplied by N21 divided by what? N22. So you will see that that is going to be N11 multiplied by N22, and then N21 multiplied by what? N12, and that is why we call it what? The cross product. I'm stuck. Right. Okay. That's why we call it the cross product ratio, and you can see it is shown here. So we can also construct the confidence interval here. Okay, when you construct the confidence interval, and then you compute the interval, and you find out that it is entirely above 1, then we will say that the probability that the outcome is present is higher for the exposed group than for the unexposed group. If it is below 1, then the probability that the outcome is present is lower in the exposed group than in the what? Unexposed group. In this case, that exposure will be what? Will be a protective exposure. For instance, a vaccination. So that babies who have taken the measles shot, you would expect to have fewer measles cases amongst those children who have taken the shot than children who do not take the shot. Okay, and if the confidence interval contains 1, we do not conclude, because the probability is equally likely in the two groups. Okay, so some of the properties of odds ratio, X and Y are independent. You will say that the exposure and the factor are independent, and the outcome are independent if the odds ratio is equal to 1. Okay, and then if odds ratio is greater than 1, it implies that what? The success are higher for the exposed. Success might not necessarily be something positive. It could be the outcome of a disease or a disease state. So the outcome is higher for this group than if the odds ratio is less than 1, then the outcome is less likely for that group. Okay, so values of odds ratio further away from 1 in a given direction represent what? Stronger association. So if you move further above 1, it's showing you a stronger association, or move further below 1, it's also showing what? The protective nature of that exposure. Okay, so we'll take this example. For you can see here you have exposure here, and then no matter how you change the orientation of the table, the odds ratio is the same. For instance, here I have my exposure as my rows, and then my outcomes as my column. And in this case, we have the outcomes as the rows, and the exposure or non-exposure as what? As the column. Orientation doesn't change it. So in this case, we have those who are exposed. We have initially at risk 2,000. Okay, were exposed. And then we have those who are not exposed, 8,000, and number of deaths in the exposed was 15, not exposed was 30. And then when you look at the cumulative person years at risk for the exposed is 3,985, for the unexposed is 15,970. So what is the risk ratio? So it will be what? The risk of death in the exposed group divided by what? The risk of death in the what? Not exposed group. In this case, it's going to be 15 over 2,000. When you divide that by 30 divided by 8,000, that is the risk ratio in this case. And then we also have what we call the rate ratio. Now, when we talk about rate, the time factor is brought in. So when we're talking about the rate ratio, we're looking at the total person years at risk. So it's going to be 15 divided by total person years for those in the exposed group, and 30 divided by total person years in the unexposed group. And then the odds ratio And the odds ratio in this case is what? 15 divided by what? 2000 minus what? 15. Okay? And then we'll look at that's the population because 15 were deaths. And then the other one is 30 divided by 8,000, take away the number of deaths in that group. Okay? So what is the relationship between odds ratio and relative risk? You can see that if you write the formula for odds ratio as this, which is the P1 probability of occurrence divided by its complement, probability of not occurring, it's going to be P1 over 1 minus P1. And then you have that of P2 over 1, which P1 over P2 is actually what? Your relative risk. So we can talk about odds ratio being what? Relative risk multiplied by this value. Okay, and then when P1 and P2 are both close to 0, then the odds ratio and relative risk will have a very similar values. Okay, and then like we have said earlier, when doing absolute comparison, then we're looking at what? A difference in values. So we can be looking at risk difference, which is the risk in the exposed minus the risk in the unexposed, or we're looking at what? A rate difference, which is the incidence rate in the exposed minus incidence rate in the unexposed. And this will be called what we call the attributable risk, is the risk difference. So attributable risk is a measure of exposure effect that indicates on an absolute scale how much greater the frequency of the disease is in the exposed group compared to the non-exposed, assuming that the relationship between exposure and disease is causal. If the relationship between the disease and exposure is not causal, there's no basis for this. That means the disease outcome is independent of the causal factor. So we have risk difference is the differences in their respective risk, and rate difference is the difference in their respective rate. So let's look at how do we calculate the risk difference and then the absolute or absolute risk. You can either call it a risk difference or you call it the absolute risk. So the risk difference is simply a difference of the two proportions. Like we did earlier, we calculated the risk for group 1, exposed, and the risk for what? Group 2. So the absolute risk, or what will the risk difference or attributable risk, is simply what? The difference in these two risk estimates. So you can also construct the confidence interval. And you know that when you're doing a relative comparison rather, when you have the value of 1, then the numerator and denominator are equal. That means what? You can say that the risk in the numerator group and that of the denominator group are about the same. But when you're looking at differences, the exposed risk in the exposed and the unexposed will only be about equal if you have the difference being 0. Then we say that the risk is equal for the two groups. So it is when our confidence interval in this case contains 0 that we cannot conclude. If the confidence interval is above 0, okay, it's positive, so we'll conclude that probability for the outcome is present is higher in the population for group 1 if the interval is above 0, it's positive. If it is below 0, then we say that the risk is higher for the unexposed group than for what? The exposed group in this case. And then we cannot conclude that the probability of the outcome differs for the two groups if the interval contains what? 0, because it is equally likely for the two groups. Okay, so in summary, we talked about prevalence. We talked about prevalence as a measure of disease frequency. We talked about that amongst population with proportion. And then we also talked about incidence. Incidence has to do with the new cases. And for prevalence, we're interested in the number of cases in the entire population, which can be a point prevalence or a period prevalence. What about the risk? We can be talking about what? Cumulative risk, or we can talk about what? Incidence density or cumulative incidence. For incidence density, we need to know the percent time, the exposed period for each individual in the population. But for incidence, cumulative incidence, we simply want to know the number of new cases in the time period divided by what? The total number of persons who were at risk or disease-free at the beginning of the study. But for the density, we need to know the percent time for each of the person in the in the population to know the cumulative exposed period for all the persons in the population. So we can talk about incidence rate. The key thing we need to know is that we should be able to tell who are the disease-free persons and who are the number of cases. For prevalence and incidence, the denominators are usually the thing we should watch out for. While for prevalence is the entire number of persons in the population. The number of infected cases is also part of the denominator. For incidence, the number of infected cases is not part of the denominator. The denominator is also a disease-free at the beginning of the period. If we're looking at cumulative incidence, if we're looking at incidence density, then it is the total number of person years at the beginning, at the end of the period from the beginning of the study time. Okay, and then we'll also look at measures of exposure effect. For measures of exposure effect, we considered what relative comparisons and we consider absolute comparisons. For relative comparisons, you can look at risk ratio, you can look at rate ratio, and then for absolute comparison, we looked at attributable risk for each one of them, and you can also look at the odds ratio when looking at relative comparison. For ratio comparison, relative comparison, when you have 1, then the risk is equally likely for both exposed and unexposed group. But when you're doing absolute comparison, when you have 0 in the confidence interval, then you cannot conclude. Then the risk is about the same for each of the 2 groups. Thank you very much, and I hope to meet you in another session very soon. I hope I've not overloaded you today. If you have any issues, and then you know that you have your study guide, you have the things you have to assess and the things you have to submit for me. The dates I'm sure the dates have elapsed, so we have to revise the date because we started behind schedule. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Yes, my baby.